do this work because it usually costs money. Now, I want to just flag that it usually costs money because sometimes we can use volunteers to do this work, and so we can do so in a way that is not incurring substantial cost to the organization. But for the most part, doing advocacy within our nonprofit organizations costs us money, and so that's why we need to fundraise for it, similar to other programs. A second similarity is that typically a mix of funding sources will be helpful for us as we think about stability in our resources. A mix is typically good. And third, we typically want, similar to other funding for other programs, we typically want our funding structure to allow us to have continuity in this area of service, as opposed to having funding that requires us to stop and start depending on the flow of funding sources. So those are a couple of examples of the way that funding for advocacy is just like funding for any other program. But there are some things that are unique about fundraising for advocacy. I'll name them here, and then we'll dig in to each of them. First of all, advocacy, as I hope you know from previous webinars, is a broad term which includes lots of activities, one of which is lobbying. It's not exactly the same activity. It's one of the activities that's included in lobbying, in advocacy. And lobbying itself has some specific funding prohibitions, which I will explain. A second way that funding for advocacy is different, fundraising for advocacy is different than other programming, is that it's long-term work, and the wins can be years apart. And some of our programming is like that, but as we know, some programming is very short-term work, and we can achieve successes in a much smaller time frame. Also, advocacy can be hard to count and evaluate, and often we need to think about our contribution rather than specifically attribution to the success in this work. And also, I'll just point out that the common narrative is that it's hard to fund for advocacy and that few funders are interested in this work. So we hope as this conversation continues, we'll answer that question, and it's kind of a yes and no.
And Susie, can I add another difference that I think about advocacy is that we tend to work more in coalition in advocacy. Think about the Minnesotans United Coalition and the size of that coalition, or the Mini Minds Coalition, which is working on early childhood education right now. So it's harder sometimes to define roles and figure out who is supposed to be funding the work as well.
For sure. Thank you. That's a great example. Very real-life example, and it's related to the contribution versus attribution.
Right.
But we can think about how sometimes coalitions are funded as the whole group. Sometimes each individual organization needs its own fundraising. Typically, it's a combination of both.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll dig in a little bit on each of the points about how it's unique. Did that advance? Okay. First, I'd like to talk about the legal issues, and I'd really like to invite you to contact me directly after this session or send a question into the chat if there's any additional information that you'd like here, because we need to get this right. But we don't need to spend tons of time worrying about the legal issues. We just need to understand them as our context. So I'd like to talk about individual donors, community foundations, and private foundations. Individual donors, I'm going to share with you what's on this bullet point, but then I need to add a little bit of a clarification. Individual donors don't have limits or restrictions on funding advocacy. Often individual donors are best funders of this work, as you might think of in your own organizations. Very typically, individual donations to our organizations are unrestricted. It gives us a lot of flexibility in the way we use those resources. That is often the case, not always. The clarification that I want to make sure that is understood here, and I should put it in this PowerPoint to be clear, is that lobbying is different than advocacy for individual donors as it is in other instances. And individual donors who earmark their funding, their donation for lobbying, are not eligible for a charitable deduction. So many of our individual donors expect that they'll get a charitable deduction for their contribution if we're a 501c3 organization. And if they give us an unrestricted gift, $50, $100, $1 million, unrestricted, then they get a deduction for that.
And we are free to use that.
And we are free to use that, thank you, Mary, as we wish.
Right.
So unrestricted individual donations we love. But if you have a donor who wants to earmark the contribution specifically for lobbying, you need to let them know that that is no longer eligible for the deduction. I didn't include it in there originally because I think it's a very rare circumstance that we would ask for a contribution to be made that way, or somebody would request that they make it that way. But if that happens, please be aware of that detail. The second legal issue is related to community foundations, and community foundations include those such as the Minneapolis Foundation or the Headwaters Foundation for Justice. Community foundations in their legal structures are 501c3 nonprofit organizations just like us. They raise money to give it away. Community foundations, like us, have no restrictions on advocacy, and they may fund us to do advocacy to any extent they deem appropriate. They also may fund us directly to do lobbying work, but as 501c3 organizations just like us, they have limits in the lobbying work that they can do, and the lobbying work that they fund specifically counts against their lobby limit. So that's actually something the community foundation itself needs to be aware of and tracking more than the recipient organization, but just something to be aware of is that they are free to fund us either broadly for advocacy or more specifically for lobbying, but it will need to count against their own lobby limits. Private foundations such as Bremer or McKnight, Northwest Area, Phillips, many others you're aware of in this community, have different rules. Private foundations are strictly prohibited from both lobbying as their own entities or from funding lobbying. So you shouldn't ask and you will not receive a grant from a private foundation that specifies that the work to be done is lobbying. Private foundations may certainly fund advocacy activities, and they also are certainly free to fund general operating grants to nonprofit organizations that do advocacy and lobbying. They just may not fund the lobbying directly. So a private foundation you may find is more likely to contribute in a way that's more broad and general, even if they're aware of the fact that you do lobbying, because they have a strict prohibition. And finally, I just want to highlight, and any of you who have done fundraising requests to foundations in the community here have probably recognized this, but some foundations have their own rules against funding lobbying or anything that might be perceived as political activity, any advocacy activity, even if the law allows them to fund these activities. So that's their purview. That would be their internal rules and regulations as opposed to the federal laws that affect their activities. But please do check foundation guidelines and their own internal prohibitions before approaching funders. Let's see. My slide is not advancing. Bear with me for just a moment. Okay. So next let's talk about the fact that this is long-term work. This can be challenging as a funding effort because sometimes it can take years and years of effort to achieve a win, and actually, as many of you know, sometimes after years and years of effort, what we end up with is a loss. But what I hope to convey today is that despite the fact that this is long-term work that could end up in a win or loss, that there are important ways to think about this that will help your funding. One of the ways to think about is if we have a policy goal that's achievable in 10 years, what is it that our organization is going to be doing specifically between now and then that will advance us toward the 10-year goal? I'd like to recommend that the important thing that we think about is bullet point number 3 there, is to develop short-term strategies that capture the attention and interest of funders that are interested in systems change. Clearly giving the funders the context that you're in this for the long haul and that this may take 10 years or more and that you're not likely to get the big win this year is really important context, but indicating to them that there are strategic short-term efforts that are going to build your ability to get there is a very important strategy with funders. It's also really important to think about whether there are funders that might be able to stay with you for much or all of the long-term campaign. Building the case that your strategies will add up to a long-term win and inviting them to be with you for the long term will help you gain some of the stability in funding that will help you be present throughout your whole campaign. Also, it's important to think about how will your funders evaluate your work if your short-term strategies are compelling and successful, but your long-term goal isn't achieved. We know that the long-term goal is uncertain for many of the years along the way to get there, and really explaining to your funders that the short-term work adds up to important success along the way, even if the long-term goal isn't achieved, is the best way to build your relationship, your long-term relationship with your funders. One way to do that is to show that all that you've built along the way in your short-term efforts is really building the capacity to be able to carry out your next strategic effort. And finally, it's really important to educate potential funders about the long-term reality of the work while you're applying for short-term funding. So while it may be very enticing to respond to an RFP or apply for a short-term funding request and just tell them the very one thing that you're going to do that appeals to them and speaks to their program interests, to the extent that you have the opportunity to describe the context that this is just one piece of a longer-term puzzle that you're building toward will help your long-term efforts with them. You really want them to stick with you if they can throughout. And also I'd just like to add one of the ways that we can use our long-term, we can acknowledge the long-term effort and build the wins toward the future is to give examples of the past wins that you've had that demonstrate your potential for future success. I'd like to just pause for a minute to talk about a really recent example that we've probably all seen in the news is that just this week, I think, or maybe it was last week, there was a big win in the world of job seeking for people who have criminal background records.
Right.
Criminal records. Right. And the Target Corporation determined that they were going to make a change in the way they look at applicants. The history of that is that there's been a coalition that's been working for years and years and years and years, the Second Chance Coalition. I think I read 65 organizations have been involved in that. And in the last legislative session, they had a big win called Ban the Box, and that was a legal change in Minnesota. And then following that, one of the organizations in the coalition, Take Action, had a meeting with the Target Corporation that decided to take this stance, a Ban the Box type stance, for all of their applicants nationwide, which is a huge win. Anybody who is involved in that effort should really take the opportunity with their funders to show them how this good work over all those years, working in coalition, working with legislative strategies and directly with corporations, is an example of the capacity and the strategies for success. Mm-hmm. Showing your funders that you have that kind of potential and that after many, many years you had that great win is one of the ways to engage them for future support. Did you have anything to add to that? No. Okay. Okay. The next thing we'll talk about a little bit is how this work can be hard to count and evaluate. And if we just pause for a second and think about if you are a food shelf and there's a hungry family and they come to your food shelf and you give them a bag of groceries, then you can count a success. You can count a success for a family that had a need that was met. It's short-term, and it's really important, and it's really countable. And then if you think about the long-term efforts to sustain and enhance food supports for all families who are hungry in the nation, that's really long-term work. It has lots of ups and downs, and it's really hard to count the specifics along the way. So let's talk about that a little bit. One of the things that's really important in our advocacy efforts when we're thinking about fundraising is to just ask ourselves, in addition to what is the big goal, what is it that we will measure and evaluate along the way? And how is it that what we're measuring and evaluating will indicate that we're building toward the long-term goal? And how can we show this progress to potential funders? I recommend that one of the ways we think about this is to show them that we're building the capacity to get better and better and better at what we do along the way. And the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 little bullet points at the bottom there are examples of things that we can count that on their own are good points, and collectively they show that we're moving toward the end goal and that we have increased capacity for effectiveness. The first one is, how can we show that we have an increased constituency of people who are engaged in this issue? In a long-time public policy issue, we all know that we need the public to be engaged and we need more and more people to be interested. So how are you counting? Are you keeping a list? Are you reading letters to the editor and seeing how many people weigh in on this? Are you making phone calls and asking your supporters how they feel about it? Some way that you can count and show an increased number of people who are engaged in the issue is a way to count and evaluate a short-term success. Another way is to show that there's increasing public understanding of the issue. The marriage campaign that Mary mentioned is a great example of that. They were a very sophisticated campaign that had the resources to do lots of public polling, and there was public polling by other interested parties as well. We can't all do that, but there are other ways that we can gauge public understanding. But that was an issue where we could see over time that the public was truly thinking about and changing the way they understand the issue as they ultimately advanced toward a win. Internally, we could do surveys. There are a variety of things we could do. We could look at public polling that other people do, but showing an increased public understanding of the issue is a benchmark that we can measure. Similarly, increased visibility of the issue. You can do newspaper reading as a basic way to understand how visibility of the issue is increasing. You can watch social media. You can look at a variety of public measures to see, is this issue becoming more and more visible so more people are understanding it, which means we're making progress. I think Ban the Box is an example, again, of one that has become substantially more visible over time, finally ending up this week with a great piece in the New York Times to celebrate their success.
May I add to Susie that going back to an increased constituency of people who are engaged, I would also say an increased number of advocates. One of the things that we do at the YWCA is training on civic participation for parents of our youth development kids and parents of our early childhood education. And one of the things that funders like to see us count is the number of parents who are trained in speaking at the legislature and trained in speaking to their policymakers, because it's at the core of empowerment.
Great. That's a great example, Mary. Thanks. So under increased constituency, thinking about the different kinds of constituencies. Maybe you have general supporters, and then you have these very high-level supporters. Maybe you have others, but a variety of constituencies that are making progress on this. Another thing to look at and measure is a growing body of research, data, and knowledge about the issue. And one of the things that we should really be thinking about in our own organizations is, how are we contributing to the research, the data, and the knowledge about the issue? It's long understood that nonprofit organizations and nonprofit advocacy groups really are the home of information and data about the issues. The people in the Second Chance Coalition know who's leaving, who has a criminal record and is looking for a job, how hard is it to get the job, what do they experience. The extent to which we can put that information together into materials that are helpful and that are instructive for policymakers will help us in our cause. And many of us are doing that anyway, even if we're not necessarily counting that and describing it to our funding sources as important progress. I'd like to call your attention to something that came out last week from the Jobs Now Coalition, which is an organization that's been working for years and years and years on job and wage issues and is currently very involved in Minnesota's minimum wage campaign, which is poised for success in the coming session. And just last week, they put out a study called A Raise for Minnesota, Statewide Demographic and Economic Effects of Raising the Minimum Wage to $9.50 an hour. This is a really nice study. It has lots of data and charts and graphs. It will be used in the debate. It's a part of the body of knowledge that's going to be important for policymakers in the upcoming session, and it's something that a funder, I imagine, would absolutely love to see as an important incremental step in the process, something to share with their funders. And then finally, I'd like to suggest that something that we can count and evaluate is the increasing number of policymakers who support our goal. And we can count that in a variety of ways. We can have private conversations with lawmakers. We can do public events with lawmakers. We can have our members talk to their own legislators, our members or our constituents, or, for example, the parents who are in the child care program at the YWCA. There are a variety of ways that we can get that information. We can look at their voting records, but showing incremental increases in the numbers of policymakers who support our goal is a really great way to show our funders, our partners, that we are making progress. So some of the things that we really struggle with are how do we count and evaluate, but there are several important ways that we can break this down and do it in a way that really shows the progress we're making and the capacity we're building in our organizations. I'd like to just spend a little more time, 2 more slides, talking about some of this background and techniques. And then Mary will talk about some examples from the field. But I'd like to just remind you that you are most welcome to chat with us and send a question in if you'd like to ask questions along the way. We'll also have some time at the end. I'd like to just spend a little time talking about contribution versus attribution, and this gets to Mary's previous point about working in coalition. In many, 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 if not essentially all nonprofit advocacy efforts, the work is collaborative. It's either directly in coalitions, strategic coalitions that come together to get things done, or if not in that kind of planful way, done in loose coalitions or in collaboration. It's a rare policy effort where one organization is working on their own. And that's part of the excitement of this work, it's part of the strength of this work, and it also is part of what is kind of a nuanced challenge as we seek resources to do this work. So thinking about and talking with our funders about the fact that we are both a critical part of getting this done and not the only entity that made it happen is kind of the line we need to walk. It is possible, and it probably happens all the time, that an organization might say, we did this. This is our effort and our success. The fact is our funders, whether they're individuals in the community, whether they're institutions, corporate funders, our funders have a broad view of society and understand that others are doing this work as well. So they know, for example, that the Second Chance Coalition had 65 members and that there are many, many, many kinds of organizations that made this work happen. So I think there's risk in claiming all of the credit, but it is really, really important that we can show how our contribution was part of what added up to the success. So I have some questions here, and I would just suggest that we think about these kinds of questions as we are thinking about how we're going to describe our work as a contributor to this success. One is who really makes a public policy change happen, and if we think about our own work, let's think about those around us that made it happen as well. What is our specific role in making it happen? I'll use the case of the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits, for example. We do a lot of public policy work, always in coalition. We never claim credit for the whole thing. And one of the ways that we can uniquely describe our role is that our relationship is with nonprofit organizations. Our relationship is not with the public, voting members of the public. We can't get this work done without working in collaboration with people who are in contact with regular members of the public. We also don't have our contacts in the faith community, for example, and often that's a place where we work with others. And so thinking about what your unique role is, Mary's unique role at the YWCA is they have relationships with parents, right. Parents of small children. That's often not the only thing that's needed.
Right, and we are in coalition with many advocacy organizations who have a systems change lens and look at it, and the value that we bring to that role is the voices of the parents, the actual work on the ground. And they find that very valuable, and that's what we can do for the coalition.
So being clear about what your own role is and how that role makes sense for your organization is going to be compelling to funders. And then also being clear about the roles of others and why their roles complement yours and you complement theirs is a way that you can tell a story to your funder that doesn't force them or you to think that it's all your success, and it allows both of the parties in this funding relationship to acknowledge that there are multiple contributions to the success. It's also important to think about who else might be claiming credit and who else might be sharing their success with you. How are you collaborating on attracting the attention and the interest of the funding community? If you think about the work that you're doing in coalition with others, it may be that sometimes you want to recognize that you and your 17 coalition partners are all applying for the same grant, so you're competing against each other and telling a similar story. In that case, it would behoove you to be honest about the breadth of the coalition. But in other cases, you might think, if we're all applying to the same funder, why don't we get together and have a conversation with them together and see if there's some sort of collaborative funding opportunity that they might consider. And then finally, I just suggest focus on a specific, unique, measurable role of your organization, your unique mission, your unique constituency in the incremental steps that made the success happen or will make it happen, and share the attribution of the final result with those who worked with you along the way. And the next slide is just a little overview of advocacy fundraising techniques. And after this, we'll talk a little bit about specific funders that might be interested in some of these techniques. So the first one, as I mentioned before, thinking about building your resources for advocacy, think about your individual donor potential. Often in our organizations, individual donor resources are highly sought for a variety of program and advocacy purposes because they tend to be unrestricted funds. But the extent to which your individual donors can support this work, not earmarked specifically for lobbying, will give you flexibility in how you do your work. The second great approach is to use general operating grants for this. In part, that's good because, as we know, private foundations may not fund lobbying, and they may be cautious about funding advocacy or anything that seems political, but they're great general operating funders, and the extent to which you can attract general operating funds that have some flexibility in them and that allow you to approach all funders, that's a great strategy. Another one would be to do broad program-related grants that include advocacy as one component. So I'll go back to the food shelf example. If you have a funder who's interested in funding hunger relief, short-term hunger relief, offering a bag of groceries to a family who's hungry, have a conversation with that funder about the context in which that hunger occurs. That occurs in a context which is includes poverty issues and includes wage issues and includes SNAP at the federal level, includes all kinds of systems change issues. And if your organization has an advocacy approach to solving hunger that complements your direct service approach, explore with that funder whether they would be willing to add that component into their grant. It's entirely possible that a direct service funder understands the advocacy context and would be willing to add, another 20 or 30% onto your service grant to be able to do some related advocacy. Another approach is specific advocacy project grants that propose to undertake a limited advocacy activity. So in your advocacy plan, you have 17 activities, and it's going to take you 12 years to achieve it, and you have 35 coalition partners, but you can break it down into some very specific limited advocacy activities. We could look at the previous slide where we had increasing constituents of community, people who are engaged, increasing public understanding, increasing visibility, growing the body of research. Pick one specific item from there and propose that. It could be that the Jobs Now Coalition proposed a very specific activity, which was increase the publicly available research and body of evidence that the minimum wage is valuable. And there may be a funder that's very interested in that specific thing. Sharing with them the context that this is where it fits in the long-term strategy is really important, but they may be interested in taking a bite like that with you. Another option, as I mentioned previously, is joint proposals for coalition work. Have a conversation with your coalition partners about where their funding comes from and whether there are funders who would be interested in funding you together. Consider doing a specific individual donor fundraising appeal, such as a board campaign or major donors for people who are interested in specifically in advocacy. If they would give that as unrestricted funds, that's even better. If they choose to give it for lobbying, please be sure you have a conversation with them about their charitable tax deduction. And then finally, consider redirecting resources from your organization's unrestricted funds, such as earned income or membership fees, toward your advocacy work. Not every organization has any or much resource in this area, but many organizations do have some unrestricted income, earned income, board funds, membership fees that could be redirected for this purpose, and that's a way to create a sustainable long-term funding source for your work. So we've covered a lot: legal issues, the challenges of this being long-term, the challenges of counting and evaluating coalition work, some specific techniques. But let's hear about how this really works in the field. So we're delighted to have Mary Jones from the YWCA of Minneapolis here with us. She's their Chief Advancement Officer, so she raises money. And they do a lot of advocacy, and Mary will share several examples with us.
Good morning, everyone. So I am here to talk a little bit about examples from the field, and I will tell you that the source I use most often in my thinking about this is a book called Forces for Good by Leslie Crutchfield and Heather McLeod Grant. And in that book, they talk about the practices of high-impact nonprofits. And there are a couple of ways that this applies to policy work. And the first one I wanted to talk about is events. And what Leslie Crutchfield and Heather McLeod Grant say is that high-impact nonprofits use annual conferences or events as a way to convene their larger community, because policy and advocacy work is, at its core, community building, I believe, and that's how the YWCA works. And the example that I would have here is from my years as the executive director of Women Winning, which is a 501c4 advocacy organization, but I would say this technique applies to 501c3s as well, that has an annual event that is really meaningful to its supporters. When you talk to longtime fundraisers like me about annual events, they tend to poo-poo them. They don't like events. They are typically not efficient ways to raise money. They'll start talking to you about return on investment, and while that is true, events have a very specific purpose in building community. So when you're analyzing events and you're thinking about what's your return on investment, you need to think about indirect return and indirect benefits as well as the direct dollars. And that benefit is getting all of the data on your members and giving them a meaningful experience, keeping them with you for the long haul, as Susie said. And these are individuals, so their dollars tend to be easier to use for policy and lobbying. I would say that if you can provide something that's not just rubber chicken, it's going to be much more meaningful for the organization. What we did at Women Winning is that there was a parade of women who were elected officials every year, and it never failed to give me a chill. And it kept you going year after year because you got to watch the parade get bigger every year, and you got to watch people that you specifically supported for office, like Amy Klobuchar, in the parade, and you got to see the evidence of the work that you'd been doing over the years. So you had a real tangible example of what happens with long-term advocacy work.
I just want to jump in for a second. This is Susie. I've been to that event, and watching something like that, which is really, in the case of Women Winning, it is the recipients, it's the beneficiaries of the organization's work, walking through that hall, getting applause. It's very inspiring and a great example of how an event helps you really see the impact of the work and really inspires you to pull your checkbook out of your purse.
And I would add another example. I was at the Planned Parenthood event last night, and no matter what your politics are, I will tell you that Planned Parenthood is very good at keying you up for what the issues are going to be. You know, it's a fundraiser, so they're there to raise money. They key you up for what the issues are going to be over the next couple of years and really help develop the deep understanding, as Susie was talking about the issues in the field. What's going to happen in North Dakota this coming session? What's going to happen in South Dakota? Planned Parenthood is a great example if you want to benchmark against an advocacy organization that's very good at building community. They do a terrific job. At the YWCA, I'd like to go back to Forces for Good again. One of the things that Crutchfield and Grant say is that the best nonprofits both advocate and serve. This is back to what Susie said about the YWCA's ability to provide parents as part of the policy discussion, or be the voice for the recipients as part of the policy discussion. The best nonprofits couple policy reform with programs or direct services to create more impact. By operating programs on the ground, they gain a first-hand view of the problems facing their constituents and can test new models to inform their proposed policy solutions. So if I had anything to leave you with, it would be that you have incredible power in the policy conversation because you provide the voice for the people that lawmakers are serving on a day-to-day basis. Some of the ways that we've done that at the YWCA is with research and collaboration. Back to what Susie was saying about increasing the research in the field, the YWCA has a partnership with the Humphrey School, and in that partnership we explore the intersection between institutionalized racism and child care policy. We talk about the effects of child care policy on families, low-income families and people of color, and we've created a body of research that we can give to other coalition partners and that we also use at the legislature. This is something that funders are interested in supporting because it increases the ability of lawmakers to make good decisions, so without being direct lobbying. So it's been a very good effort for us, and we're actually on our third white paper on that work. Another thing that we do at the YWCA that we have found that funders find attractive is grassroots training. So back to giving the people that we serve the skills to advocate for themselves, which, by the way, they have forever, right? So we teach them to be an advocate this year on this issue, child care assistance, and they have you can watch the lights go on. It's a joyful situation to watch the lights go on at their eyes and realize that they can call their legislators anytime, right? They can be in relationship with their lawmakers, that it's part of their rights as civilians. So that's a great example of something that funders find attractive support that's not actually grassroots lobbying but goes to the empowerment in our mission. Back to building community for just a minute. I have a couple of other comments that aren't on the slides. because I think that building community is a very important part of policy work. We have found at the YWCA that our Young Leaders Group is interested in policy and in racial justice work. So we have, and many of you may have, a Young Leaders Coalition as an effort to bring younger donors and leaders into the organization. That group at the YWCA likes to have a lot of fun. They go on bike rides, they do happy hours, but they are also available for postcard campaigns and other kinds of advocacy activities, and their dollars can support our advocacy. I wouldn't ignore the role of social media in advocacy fundraising. What we have found is that it's not a great way to acquire donors, but it's a great way to steward your community. So the YWCA ended up on the front page of CURA's newsletter, the Center for Urban and Regional Affairs, this fall. We sent out a link to that right away to all of our constituents. If you want to look at best examples of best practices for using social media to build constituents, I would look at the Sierra Club's website and the work that they do on building a community through social media. So these are kind of some examples from the field and how the YWCA works to build community.
Thanks, Mary.
Sure.
Great. So next, let's talk about where's the money. A little earlier, when we were talking about what's unique about fundraising for advocacy, I included the point that the common narrative is that it's hard to fund advocacy and few funders are interested in this work. So is this true or not? So let's take a look at the funders. But first I just want to say this actually is hard. This is hard. We're not here to say that this is easy, but we're here to suggest that there are funders who are interested in this work, and there are some specific techniques that we can use that will help us be successful. I do public policy here at the Council of Nonprofits, and I fundraise all the time to try to build the resources we need to do this work. It's hard, it's constant, it's tireless, but we hope that the examples that we're providing will help you get a start on this. So where is the money? We wanted to just call attention to a few foundations that Mary and I, have recognized as being interested in this work. Now, this is not a list that's based on hard research. This is very anecdotal. This is not an exhaustive list. This is some examples. The McKnight Foundation, as you all well know, is large and gives away an enormous amount of money in lots of different program areas. They are a funder that we have observed is interested in and willing to engage around systems change. They may call it systems change instead of advocacy. I'm actually not sure about that. But they understand that the services that are provided in the community have a context, which is a systems context. And they have historically provided funding that's general operating or broad program funding, where you might find that within that resource that you can get from them, that there's some room to do advocacy and lobbying.
This would be, and my caution is within their guidelines. So,
of course.
Right, McKnight Foundation has a particular interest in environmental organizations. That's where you will see them funding advocacy work within environmental organizations.
Good example.
Yep.
The Northwest Area Foundation has gone through many changes in recent years, but they have certainly shown an interest in understanding and embracing particularly issues of poverty and race, and the systems change and policy areas within those subject areas. The Phillips Family Foundation is also one that has gone through some changes in recent years, splitting from one foundation in this community to three, one in Minnesota, one in Colorado, I think the third is in California. So the Minnesota version of the Phillips Family Foundation, they of course also have their own particular program areas. I believe they are housing and
career readiness,
some other stuff. But their view of the world takes into account systems change and advocacy, for sure. They understand that. I also just want to mention the Joyce Foundation. This is a foundation that is in Chicago. They are a foundation that in their original charter and in their mission Their resources are intended to be distributed in 6 Midwestern states, including Minnesota, and they really get policy, really, really get it. I don't know the extent of their entire portfolio, but a fair amount of their portfolio, I believe, funds advocacy and systems change and policy. They fund in a number of areas. One is democracy, another is education. I think there might be one on the environment. I'm not sure. You should check their website. But they really get it, and I think they could potentially be a funder that we don't know so much about here in Minnesota because they're not based here within the state of Minnesota, but they fund here, and I believe quite a lot. Those are just some examples. I'm sure there are many others. If there are any funders on the call who wish that they were on this list, please don't hesitate to email me after, and when we send out the email after this webinar, we can include you as a funder. Community foundations, as I mentioned before, are different than private foundations in that they have more flexibility in the way they fund, but we just wanted to call out some that maybe are really obvious to you, but that are really interested in public policy work. Minneapolis Foundation is just doing a funding round right now. I'm not sure if they've made their decisions or not, but they're very oriented toward policy and systems change, particularly within the city of Minneapolis proper, and particularly with attention to issues of racial disparities and the work that they've done on their One Minneapolis report. So if you're interested in approaching them for funding, take a look at their One Minneapolis report, which will highlight to you some of their areas of interest. The Headwaters Foundation for Justice has long been a funder of social justice advocacy and community organizing, typically for organizations that are on the smaller size of organizational budget. I don't know what the particular number is. The Women's Foundation of Minnesota is really special in recent years in that they have been both a funder of policy and advocacy and an advocate themselves. And they've really developed a recent effort and successful model around the Girls Are Not For Sale campaign to stop trafficking of teen women. And they have been a real partner with their grantees on moving this advocacy question together. And then the St. Paul and Minnesota Community Foundations are foundations that are sort of joined at the hip. They work together and live together and also have a long interest in policy and advocacy.
I would add the Sheltering Arms Foundation, which is actually a community foundation and has an interest in families, and especially young families and early childhood.
Yes, thank you. That was an oversight, Sheltering Arms, and they, I believe, have a funding round where their applications are due like right around December or January. So if you're interested in that, take a look at their website today. I want to also just give you a little sense, this is from some research that I'll refer to on the next slide, of the types of funding that have occurred historically. I think the sample was from like 2002 to 2008 or something, to fund advocacy and organizing and civic engagement in Minnesota. So 45% of all of the funds for this kind of work came as general operating. So in case you're thinking, yeah, it's hard to get general operating, we never get that, nobody wants to fund what we call overhead. Well, this isn't overhead we're talking about. What I wanted to illustrate here is that there are substantial funders, at 45% of all advocacy, organizing, and civic engagement funders, that have provided general operating resources in Minnesota. 25% of the funds that flowed in this area were multi-year funds. We didn't really talk very much about that. The ability to get multi-year funding, of course, stabilizes your resource base, and a funder that understands the extent to which this is multi-year work is really a great partner if they can provide multi-year funding. Interestingly, just a very small amount of the funding in this area is for what is considered capacity building. Even though in the earlier part of the conversation, a lot of the things that we count really are building the capacity to be successful over the long term. So I think it's our challenge in this field to increase the interest of the funding community in funding capacity building for this work, essentially building the potential for success. We have a question that just popped up. What about other community foundations in the state? Do they typically fund advocacy? Thanks, Julie, for that question. We just named a few that came to us top of mind as ones that we really know are funders of advocacy. If anybody knows the answer about whether there are other community foundations in the state that are really good advocacy funders, please type that in and we'll share that answer. This list isn't meant to be exhaustive, it's just an idea, but I'd say call the community foundation in your area and just ask them directly. Mary?
Right, and the second piece of advice is to go onto GuideStar and check their 990s and look for specific grants for advocacy within the 990s of the community foundations. Duluth Superior Area Community Foundation and the initiative funds, the Northeast Minnesota Initiative Funds, I believe both do some advocacy funding. You can look at their 990s and check what actually happens in the real world with their funding.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion, and I'm glad you brought it up, Mary. The 990s are such an incredible source to be able to see patterns and specific numbers and who gets funded. And this webinar is not meant to be an advertisement, but as long as we're talking about this, I'll just mention that we also have the Minnesota Funders event. I assume many of you have probably been to that over the years. It's coming up in early December. I think it's on the 4th. And that's where, our staff has really dug into all of the main funders in Minnesota and can share information. Finally, I just want to call your attention to a couple of resources. In addition to the 990, which you can find through GuideStar, and for some foundations you can find it right on their website, the Minnesota Council on Foundations has come out with some very recent research. I think it was just last week, called Giving in Minnesota, and that shows a lot of really helpful both specifics and context. I don't believe there's a section that's specifically just advocacy funding, and actually, funding for advocacy could happen in a variety of ways. Somebody could get a program fund that includes advocacy, or somebody could call it community organizing. So I don't know that there's a specific data point in their recent research that says exactly how much advocacy funding is happening in Minnesota, but you can see a lot of information about the trends and the biggest funders, and I'd recommend giving that a look. And then the second piece is, this is where I got the information about 25% of advocacy funding is multi-year and 45% is general operating. So this is from a national organization, the National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy, that did some studies on advocacy funding in various states, including Minnesota. And the study was done over a period of a few years in the last decade. It's a long document, like about 100 pages maybe. So read the whole thing if you're interested, or click on that link and take a look at pages 37 to 46, and that'll show you specifically the funding information about Minnesota. So we hope that you find those resources helpful, as well as 990s, as well as both of us. We're really available to you over, today after this call, or next week, or over the long term. We're very interested in being of help and of service to you. That is my job at the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits, so please use me. And Mary is both an expert in the field, but she's also a board member of the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits. And so we both really share a value of helping our members and our sector succeed. And succeeding in this area is really one of the things that's going to help us be the best advocates for the people we serve and for advancing our mission. So I invite you to be in touch. And if anybody, we have about a minute left, or maybe we don't. Any final questions, please feel free to type them in. Mary, any parting comments?
Well, thank you very much for your time today.
And best wishes in your advocacy work and your efforts to fund them. Please do join us if you care to learn about evaluating advocacy for the next webinar on November 20th. Thank you.